Hello everybody, hope you're doing well. Welcome back to another video. Today I thought I'd run you through my post-processing process when it comes to editing my digital images, and also why everything that I'm about to show you doesn't matter in the slightest. The reason that I say that is because I may go into some technical things in Capture One, which is what I'm going to be processing in today, such as like exposure, tone curve, shadows, etc., etc. That doesn't really matter because the images that you're going to be taking are probably going to be different to the images I'm taking. Unless you're going out there and standing in the exact same spot, using the exact same settings as me, our images are going to be different. So the technical aspects of editing shadows, highlights, really aren't applicable across every single image that's ever going to be taken and ever has been taken. But the important thing to take away from this video is the process that I go through to draw inspiration from images that I really like and know and love, and how I can take things from those images and apply them to my own. A little bit of housekeeping as well, and just a quick tip for anybody who's looking at potentially moving forward as a photographer or an assistant. When we talk about editing, we're actually referring to editing down a large body of work, maybe like 100 images, and editing that down to 10 images. So editing actually refers to scale and the number of images in a body of work, whereas post-processing refers to how you're changing things within an image. So editing and post-processing are actually very different things, and that's a bit of a misconception on YouTube, so I just wanted to clear that up, and that's a little quick tip for anybody moving forward as a photographer. So what things actually can I draw inspiration from? So my main inspiration is not typically drawn from the image itself, not the composition, not the exposure, but actually the colors, and that's pretty much a pivotal point of photography. You know, we look at photographers like William Eggleston and Ernst Haas, who are sort of the pioneers of color photography, and we all love the colors that are in those images, and that's because they were using things like Kodachrome, etc., etc. But with film stocks that are still around today, you can actually draw inspiration from those. You don't have to draw inspiration from film stocks, but the two that I'm going to talk about today, which I draw heavily from, are Potra 400 and Potra 160. These two film stocks are probably some of the most heavily used film stocks and most widely used film stocks. They are stunning, you know, you can really push them quite far. You can overexpose these images to get a certain look. But the things I want to talk about today, and I've got a website up in front of me that is actually excellent, and I'll credit who they are. It's from the Carmen Sita Film Lab, and I believe they are based in Spain, and they've written this fantastic article about the Potra family. They talk about exposure and pushing, but I want to scroll down to this section here where they discuss the color palette, and they show you some reference images of pictures that were taken on Potra 160 and also Potra 400. So if we enlarge these images, we can see, you know, they're actually quite varying. And the things that I like to draw from Potra 160 especially is sort of those purpley warm shadows, and I really love that. I love that look. And also sort of maybe a green tint across the image itself. If we scroll down to Potra 400, you can see, again, there's quite a sort of neutral color palette, but there's like lots of blues in the highlights, and again, quite a green tint across the image. Potra 400 has very rich, dark shadows, and Potra 160 is very neutral, and that's why a lot of people use them for portraits, etc., etc. So the story behind one of the images that I'm going to show you today, you can actually see the behind the scenes of how I took this picture in my Why Your Hometown Isn't Boring video. I approached this elderly gentleman in Whitstable and asked to take his picture. And as I was editing it, I sort of went through this phase of like, what do I want this image to look like? How do I want the viewer to feel when they're looking at the image? And what can I draw from images that I love and apply that to my own work? I'd also like to apologize for the background constantly changing exposure, the sun, you know, going in and out of clouds. But we're here, we're filming the video. So if we go over into Capture One, we can see the image itself. So I actually pretty much exclusively edit in Capture One. I really am not a fan of Lightroom. I don't think it's a particularly professional bit of software. I think you can get better results out of Capture One, but you know, each to their own. It's also worth noting that most editing softwares will have the same sort of slider setup. You will have the same tools like exposure, curve, levels, clarity. So if you want to edit things in Lightroom or Luminar or whatever you're working in, you can probably transfer most of these tools across. So like I mentioned before, I really wanted to focus on the sort of the color palette of like a mesh between Potra 160 and Potra 400. And I think the thing that I settled on most is like a purpley, rich, warm shadow a greenish mid-tone or a green tint to the whole image itself, and also blue highlights. And I think with this image, this has worked particularly well. This is a raw image, but I'll have the final product up on screen. My editing style has changed a little bit since I edited this image originally. I keep referring to it as edited, I'm sorry about that. Just post-processing takes forever to get out. So if I could jump into this image to begin with, there's a couple of things I don't actually like about this image. The main one being the fact that this thing is sticking out of his head and I've cut off his hands, and that was because I was so nervous about asking this guy if I could take his portrait. Unfortunately, I cropped off the hands and there is something sticking out of his head, which is sort of like a bit of a trope when it comes to composing portraits, but it was on the go and yeah, I was nervous. So the first thing I think we need to do is fix this exposure. So he was backlit, I guess. The sun isn't behind him, but the background is definitely brighter than him, and he was in shade and shadow. So this image was actually shot sort of late evening, and my camera has sort of tried to expose the white balance, not expose the white balance, just sort of adjust the white balance so he is more neutral, and in doing so it's slightly overshot and it's become quite blue. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually warm up this image, and I'm not too concerned about the background getting warmer because the time of day was later in the evening. So that's sort of the vibe I'm going for, that's the sort of storyline I'm going for. And I always just keep zooming in to check the skin tones and make sure he's all right, essentially. He's not getting affected. And then what I'll do is I'll boost the exposure, and that looks good to me. I'm not too concerned about the background, mainly because I'm now going to crop this to a 4:5. And I've talked about this in a video before, the fact that I don't like images that are really, really tall. I don't like images that are left in their original crop. I think 35mm portrait images look really, really weird. They look extremely tall. So I think a 4:5 for this image is going to work quite nicely. You know, that sort of pays homage to like medium format, the sort of filmic look that I'm going for. Might just adjust the exposure again just a little bit, just so I can bring out a bit more detail in his coat. And then I will just bring down the highlights a touch, just so that's a bit too much maybe. I'm not too concerned about the background getting blown out because it's the background and I want him to be exposed well. So the next thing that I'm going to do is maybe, what should I do? I'm going to bring down the curve. I'm going to just, again, add a little bit of interest back into his coat, and then I'm going to boost the mids maybe, not too much. The big thing about the RGB curve is that it does actually affect the saturation of your image. You could go into the Luma tool, which is, again, something that Capture One offers, but I don't think Lightroom does. And you could then do adjustments there, but just be careful with that. It's very, very sensitive. Then I'm gonna add a tiny, just a touch of fade in the shadows, and then just bring that like that. It's also really worth mentioning, and this is one of my slight issues with YouTube, and I think that it's just a breeding ground for misinformation, is I see a lot of people will say add an S curve to your RGB curve, and then what they'll do is they'll boost up the shadow, bring down the highlights, and then they'll just add it all back in. That makes no sense. You shouldn't really be bringing shadow into the image and then taking it out again. That's not worth it. That's a weird step to take. So that's something that I try to avoid, is just adding an S curve and then bringing down the highlights and boosting the shadows. Yes, you want to get as much information out of your image as possible, but everything in my eyes moves like this. As humans, we have an understanding of what an exposed image looks like, and we like to shift it, or at least I like to shift it. So I don't want it to suddenly go from this to way like this, because I know that that looks unnatural. So I think you've got to sort of restrict yourself in how much exposure you can use and then move it accordingly. So that being said, I might just bring these shadows up a tiny bit, add a tiny bit more fade. I don't want it to be too Instagrammy. And the room in here is so bright, so I'm struggling with that a little bit. Then I'm going to bring down the saturation maybe to like -5, just to take a bit of that tint out of him, and then boost the exposure again slightly, I think. Now, this is sort of a good like base. This is how I would typically do things. I don't like to do a huge amount of detail. At this point, it's just getting a rough exposure mark for him. What I'm going to do now is head over to the color panel, And as you can see, there's a color balance here. So I'm just going to close all this. So the color balance tool in Capture One is like an homage to the color grading tools that video editors use. And I think this is a really, really intuitive tool. You have so much more control than the sliders in Lightroom. I'm not trying to pitch Capture One to you, but as I said, I think it's just generally more professional. I'm going to drag this over to the orangey side of things. See, that to me is too purple there. That's a little bit red, and I kind of want to just sort of stick it in the sort of between red and orange. I think that looks quite nice. And then I'm going to bring that way down. I'm going to get rid of it, and then I'll bring it back in, sort of reintroduce the color. If this image comes out looking a little bit weird, it's because it's so bright in this room. So one thing that you can do is like zoom in and just check that you're not losing any sort of detail by introducing color, because that can sometimes happen. So I think shadow wise, I'm pretty happy with that. I don't really touch this bit of the tool. I just don't think it's particularly helpful. Yeah, I like that. That's sort of quite a nice natural tone. It doesn't look too weird. Head over to the midtones, and I'm actually going to bung this over to green. And you can see that that's affecting his face quite a lot. There's obviously quite a lot of midtones in this image. It's pretty balanced. Like, there's a lot of shadow, there's a lot of highlights, and then there's this sort of like plateau you can see in the histogram, and that's what the midtones are going to be affecting. So if this is pretty flat, then you know that it's going to be quite general across the image. So I'm just going to move this around until I get to a point that I think looks nice. I do kind of like it sort of more towards the yellowy side because I want to introduce some blue highlights. So I think maybe about there is going to be good. And then again, bring it way down and then slowly introduce it again. So that's starting to look nice. I don't want to affect his skin tone too much, like I said. You can always just undo and then just check this. And you can see that that's evened out his face quite a lot, whereas before he was quite pink, now he's sort of pretty neutral. If anything, he's got a bit of a slight green tint to his skin. And then I'll head over to the highlight tab and I'll do the same, but I'll go to the blues because, like I said, that's something that I like in the Potra 400 stock. So that's something that I want to introduce into my image. And then I'll start introducing this. When you start messing with highlights, especially in a bright scene like this, like I said, the human eye is very trained to knowing what colors look good and which colors don't. So be very, very careful. Be quite timid with the blue slider. I think I only want to introduce it like that much. And I will check again what that's doing to the image. And as you can see, this looks pretty good so far. The colors have changed pretty drastically. And now I'm going to jump back into the exposure and adjust it. Now this will end up actually adjusting the colors that I've put into the image. However, I think it's important to just set a base and then sort of go back and forth until you are in a point that you are happy with. So I'm going to keep adjusting this image. As you can see, I haven't actually done much to the shadows down here, so I might actually just bring up the dynamic, it's called high dynamic range, this tool, but it's actually just highlights and sliders. And I think that is a good point to be at. I'm going to take out that blue. I'm not a big fan of the blue in the highlights at the moment. I think for this scene, the sunset needs to be quite yellowy. Now, you may have spotted something slightly different about this video. You might be thinking that, I don't know, Sam hasn't got any spots on his face today, or Sam's hair is actually still as much of a mess as it was yesterday. However, you might have noticed that I'm now wearing these blue light cancelling glasses, and I know there's a lot of questions about whether they're good for video and photo editing. So what I'm going to do now is actually just very quickly lift them up, check to make sure there's no weird color cast across the images, and just sort of do that a couple of times. As I can see, there's actually not that much green across the image, so I'll just very quickly adjust that. And that seems to have done the trick. So I will probably work on this image a little bit more, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the breakdown of my process. And yeah, that's sort of how I would go about editing an image. I've got a few other images loaded into here. I've got this image in particular. I love this image. I think it's possibly one of my favorite images that I've taken. I would definitely include this in a book if I was to make one. Hint, hint. I just think this is class with him eating something. I've caught him out. He's got his coffee on this like pretty spanking new like Merc or whatever, and it's pretty obvious that it's in the West End of London as well with this these lights. So I think this is a really nice image, and I will work on this in a very similar fashion. You can see it's actually pretty similar in terms of lighting and the scene itself. This was again pretty late in the evening. You can see that the sun's going down. This area is in shadow, so that's a bit of a challenge that I've got to work with. I've also got this image here, which is another favourite of mine, which I took on Oxford Street. I got this guy's little flame just lighting a cigarette. I like the fact he's holding his phone. It's a bit weird. And I like the coat he's wearing. He sort of stood out to me. He's got a very distinctive face. Again, this is another backlit image. I don't know if that's something that I like to do, but I think I will work on these images a little bit. There's also a night image in here, so you can see how that progresses and how this editing style affects different images. So I'm going to crack on and edit these images. I'll do a sped up version so you can see what I'm doing, and then we will discuss them at the end. Just a very quick interjection whilst I'm editing these photos. I think it's really worth noting that at some point I will probably stop editing these images, go and do something else, come back to them. I sometimes even do that over the course of a couple of days. I will edit an image and then I'll come back to it the next day, just so I have fresh eyes. After a while, everything is start to look the same. So I think it's really important to change up what you're looking at, and that will then in turn change how you are viewing your images. So these are the final images. I'll put them all up on screen now. I really hope you found this video useful. I really hope you take away some of the techniques that I provided you with in this video. It's really interesting to, again, take a bit of an academic approach to photography. Do not distract from the artistic side. You know, photos are there to be enjoyed, not necessarily broken down. But like I said, that comes with a background in essentially deconstructing images. And hopefully across these images you can see that there is a bit of a theme, a bit of a color theme. I definitely am sticking with this way of processing my images. I really like it. I think it looks really natural. I really like the sort of Potra 400, 160 vibe that I get with these images. And it's just something that you can apply to your own work as well. So if you actually want to see more of these like street style images, be sure to follow me over on Instagram. I'm at Samby Holt, not only on Instagram, but across all social media platforms. So be sure to hit me up, have a look. Hopefully you can again see a bit of a theme in my feed. So apart from that, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it useful. And apart from that, have a lovely day, and I shall see you in the next video.